Thanks, Stuart, and thanks, Paddy. That was just incredible and a hard act to follow, really. But I would like also to acknowledge that we are here on the Gadigal land of the Eora people. Yeah, sure. Yep. And we do acknowledge the terrible things that we've done. And we do, hope and act that we will be able to make recompense and see recompense in our own lifetime. Whether that will happen in Israel-Palestine is anyone's bet. So, like Paddy, we're talking here about history wars, and we're talking about land grabs, we're talking about oppression, and we're talking about dispossession, of a people, of a whole people. This topic means a lot to me, and this year is a good year to start looking at some of the narratives that surround Israel and Palestine, because it's 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, when Britain indicated it would support the establishment of a Jewish state. It's 70 years since the UN Resolution 181, which was in November 1947, which called for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and an Israeli state, into an Arab and a Jewish state. It was never accepted by Palestinians, and it was never accepted by the Arab states at the time, and led to the subsequent unilateral declaration of the State of Israel in May 1948. And this is what's known as the Nakba, which you've probably heard about. It means catastrophe in Arabic. And so it is remembered and recalled and commemorated every year in May, and we've just had it. Next year it'll be 70 years. So it's also been 50 years since the 1967 war, and I presume a lot of you here would have been quite aware of that at the time, the Six-Day War. This is when Israel actually commenced its belligerent occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, and that continues to today. It is, in fact, the longest military occupation in modern times, and its ongoing brutality, secrecy, illegality are shrouded in narratives which have been allowed to go mostly unchallenged in the West for far too long. Tonight, I want to think about some of these narratives that have been developed and nurtured to sustain this brutal occupation. You'd be familiar with the terms security and terrorism. They're very common these days, and of course they demonise Muslims and they demonise Arabs. In Israel, they demonise the Palestinians. And they also characterise the Palestinians in the sense that most Israelis feel threatened by Palestinians. You all could travel to Palestine, you wouldn't have any problems. You might have a few problems at the border, but you could go in and you could go to Jerusalem and you could, travel around. Not Gaza, however, and that's in fact true. Not many people get into Gaza. It's not something the rest of the world is allowed to see very much. Israelis are forbidden to go into the West Bank, and they're also terrified. So I had a friend over there who was an Australian Israeli who could have quite easily used his Australian passport and wandered in on a bus straight out of Jerusalem, no problem. Just get on a bus, go up to Ramallah or wherever. And there was no way in the world that he would do that, because he obviously felt completely threatened that his life would be taken. And in fact, there are great big red signs at all the borders or all the checkpoints saying, this is dangerous, you must not enter, Israelis must not enter here. Of course, it's full of Israeli troops, young troops, and troops that are remarkably well armed for teenagers. So I want to talk about some of these early narratives. I want to talk about some of the biblical narratives, the narratives that permeate Israeli culture that have both given, fueled extreme religious Zionism, and have also provided successive governments with any number of reasons to justify and legitimise the original and ongoing land theft and dispossession, particularly in Jerusalem. Israel's creation narratives, the stories of the birth of the Jewish state, feed the nationalism around the War of Independence. And they're ones that now, I think, are under some sort of scrutiny within Israel itself. You've probably heard the catch cry attributed to Thea Herzl, founder of Zionism. The words, a land without a people for a people without a land. Sounds very much like terra nullius, doesn't it? This was a very strong and convenient trope taken on by Herzl and generations after him, which was used to legitimise a land theft, even though he himself knew it was incorrect. Now, he's attributed as making this statement. In fact, he didn't. It was made in 1901 by an English author, Israel Zangwill, who 4 years later realised that Palestine actually had inhabitants. He says, in this quote I read, the Pashtalik of Jerusalem, and that's an area, an Ottoman description, which included Bethlehem, Hebron, Jaffa, Gaza and Beersheba, is already twice as thickly populated as the United States, which then he realised would mean that Zionists had to face the choice of driving the Arabs out or dealing with a large alien population. So this is like in 1905. He broke with the mainstream Zionism in 1905, and in 1908 he told a London court that he'd been quite naive when he made that statement, and he'd since realised the density of the Arab population, namely that twice of the United States at that time. In 1913 he criticised those who insisted on repeating that Palestine was an empty and derelict land, and they called him a traitor for reporting otherwise. And he also made this comment, which is one that I love. Consistency may be a political virtue, but there's no virtue in consistent lying. So take that as it is. I wanted to refer to the work of some of the new historians, people like the great Ilan Pappé, who was here some years ago. Now, there are a handful of authors who have revised history, have taken the documents that became available 30 years after 1948, looked at the distortions in the accepted narratives and rewritten most remarkable histories. Pappé's The Making of the Arab-Israeli Conflict was written in the early 90s, and I recommend it to you along with many other books that he's written. By the time of the Nakba in 1948, Jewish settlers had many decades of interactions with the indigenous Palestinians in the Promised Land. By the end of the 1880s, there was increased friction, and it was over water resources, pastoral lands, harvesting and land purchases. Sounds very familiar because these are the same things that are happening now and have been happening ever since. In 1886, the first violent clash occurred between the indigenous Arabs and Jewish settlers, and this led to more Palestinian protests against the Jewish settlement movement. The Mufti of Jerusalem and Muslim leaders campaigned against Zionism and the sale of land to Jews. In the early 20th century, intellectuals and journalists wrote about this conflict and focused on the question of land. It's all about land. By the 1930s, with the rise of fascism in Europe and the increased immigration into Palestine, tensions rose and the Arab Revolt occurred from 1936 to 1939. Now, from diary accounts, the early Zionists, and we have evidence, referred to the indigenous Palestinians as aliens roaming the land that belonged to the Jewish people. Many of them came assuming the land was empty, even though they were shown hospitality by many Palestinians when they arrived. Herzl led the call for the return to Israel, return to the Jewish homeland. And I'm just cutting through this. I'll give you a quick summary of the sort of conventional Zionist account of the 1948 war. This is taken from one of the new Arab historians, new Jewish historians. The conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine came to a head following the passage on November 47 of the United Nations Partition Resolution, which called for the establishment of two states, one Jewish and one Arab. At the end of the British Mandate and the unilateral proclamation of the State of Israel, Arab states sent their armies into Palestine with the firm intention of strangling the Jewish state at birth. The subsequent struggle was an unequal one between a Jewish David and an Arab Goliath. The infant Jewish state fought a desperate, heroic and ultimately successful battle for survival against overwhelming odds. And during this war, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled to the neighbouring Arab states, mainly in response to orders from their leaders, and despite Jewish pleas to stay and demonstrate that peaceful coexistence was possible. After the war, the story continues, Israeli leaders sought peace with their neighbours. Arab intransience was alone responsible for the political deadlock. And for many years, this type of standardised account of the causes and course of the Arab-Israeli conflict was mostly unchallenged. Now, key to this story is the absence of any account of the forced expulsion of 750,000 people from their homes and villages in that period of 1947-48. Many accounts say that the Palestinians fled of their own volition, or did so because they were encouraged to leave by Arab leaders. Now, some of them in the early years did leave of their own volition, but by and large, the largest percentage were forced out and fled for their lives. David Ben-Gurion said in the Knesset himself that they were encouraged to leave by the Arab leaders. However, none of these accounts mention the existence of Plan D, or Plan Dalit, which was a military plan for Jewish fighters who were fighting throughout Palestine in 1948. Palestinian historian Walid Halidi cites this plan as the last of many that existed prior to 1948, aimed at destroying and removing the Palestinian community. Plan Dalit referred to enemy bases, and these were primarily Arab villages or areas from where some hostile action had been launched against Jewish settlement and convoys, military convoys. These were civil locations, and they were targeted for attack in areas which surrounded any Jewish settlements, all strategic routes, plus the borders of the proposed UN Green Line, and anywhere within the area designated by the UN partition as future Israeli territory. And of course you can imagine there were hundreds and hundreds of villages in that territory. They were all fair game at this time. The sorts of operations which were described in the documents that have been declassified were destroying villages by setting fire to them or by blowing them up, by planting mines in the debris, expelling the populations of whole villages, shooting at them if they resisted or when they tried to return. In the words of Ilan Pappé, this was a master plan for the expulsion of as many Palestinians as possible, and it legitimised some of the more horrendous atrocities committed by Jewish soldiers. By August 1948, 286 Arab villages had been destroyed as a direct result of this plan, and many more were badly damaged and later abandoned. Now, I want to talk to you about an Israeli NGO, Zochrot. I was in Palestine in 2014, and I attended an event which indicated to me that there is some change in Israel now. Very small, but a change towards recasting Israel's creation narrative in ways which recognise, acknowledge, and seek to find recompense, or to give recompense to what happened. So just picture a large conference room, much larger than this, in the southern Israeli city of Beersheba, and a panel of commissioners listening and asking questions of Palestinian Bedouins and former Jewish fighters about their experiences from 1947, when the State of Israel was created. This definitely was not a state-sanctioned event. It was the first public hearing of the Israeli NGO Zochrot's Truth Commission for exposing Israeli society's responsibility for the events of 1948 to 1960 in the South. And what I heard and what was recorded on that day would have been regarded as heresy in Israel. Witnesses testified to specific instances of the brutality and systematic dispossession of their lands when, as I said earlier, 750,000 Palestinians became refugees. This Truth Commission was set up to reveal what had been silenced and what is still largely silenced in Israel for nearly 7 decades. In the Negev, they were looking at some 90,000 Bedouin Palestinians who were removed from their homes and lost their lands and lost their livelihoods. Now, it was conducted with an acknowledgement of the fact that the Nakba continues today. And that is still a very hard thing, to be trying to reassess, reevaluate things that happened so far in the past, while at the very same time, potentially 20 kilometres away, someone's being shot dead with a rubber bullet or shot dead with a live ammunition. I mean, this is happening, and it happens all the time in the West Bank. As Paddy said, children are dragged from homes. Aboriginal children are dragged from homes, taken from their parents. Palestinian children are dragged from their homes and taken from their parents in the middle of the night. And if you look at some of the figures of the imprisonment of Palestinian children and young adolescents, you'd be absolutely shocked and horrified. Oftentimes they're accused of throwing stones, which is against the law, and you can stay in prison for 6 months or a year or more. There's the use of administrative detention, and many people are on that, which means no crime that's known, no limit to how long you're going to be in jail, and no chance to fight it in the courts. It's fantastic. Anyway, let's get back to the Truth Commission. So I'd like to read just a couple of little excerpts from some of the testimonies that were taken during this commission. We'll start with, and you can find this all online, so everything's documented. If you look up Zochrot, Zochrot, all the testimonies are there. The day that I attended was videotaped, so you can watch the videos as well. They were simultaneously translated into Arabic, English and Hebrew. So this is one of the Jewish fighters, and he's talking about Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet of March 1948 says, no less and no more. Areas included in the map of the Jewish state that are inhabited by Arabs who harass or prevent the brigades and battalions from protecting Israel can be expelled. The villages will be evacuated and their fields set on fire. All of that was completely clear-cut. It was black and white. So what did we do? In the Negev Brigade, they started giving orders related to Plan Dalet because Israel's underbelly was in the Negev. In the last evacuations of the war in our area, the last evacuations were in 1949. We told them that they had to evacuate our territory. These are the Bedouins who lived here, where we live. And then I go on a little bit more. I just am trying to do some editing here as we're going. They told us that the peasants were returning, and we surrounded the village. I was the mortarist. I used the mortar, and the others also shot a bit. And they really ran away. It was night. They'd tried to go back. We received our orders from our platoon commander, so that everything that was done was not done by the soldiers, based on strict orders by the political level. By that time, there was a state apparatus. So this must be understood. I'm talking about 1952 to 54, when there was tremendous hardship in the Gaza Strip. People had nowhere to go. The Egyptians prevented them from going down to Egypt, and there was no point in doing that anyway. And then the people heard there was some hope in the east. You could go to Jordan and from there to the countries in the east of Syria. But we wouldn't let them go through. We had our orders because we were considered soldiers, and we were told to either kill them or prevent their passage. And they did get killed. Families, children. Some did manage to infiltrate, and we would come out in the morning and we would see traces of their nightly march. And there are lots of records of people coming back to get food because they left the fields, and they would come back when they knew the harvest was in and try and bring some food from their fields. Most people left with nothing. So I'll just give you a little bit from this testimony from a Bedouin Palestinian woman. The Jews came, took our lands by force. They had told us there was nothing left for us here. They closed down the mosque and barred anyone from entering. On the day the Jews conquered Beersheba, my father went there. He wanted to drink water from a faucet near his house, but the Jew who lived there would not let him do so. My father said to him, "You foreigner, I installed this pipe with my own hands, and I have documents that prove that these houses are ours." So the foreigner agreed to let my father drink water. How unfortunate that they took over this country and would not even let people drink the water from their own houses. Israel wants lands without people. And then she goes on a bit further. It's quite a long testimony, this woman. They took my father out of the house by force and destroyed the house. The sky was red from the fire and shooting. All this was to frighten the people. They started beating people and forcing them to take their belongings on their backs. Once they broke someone's arm and forced him to carry his belongings with his broken arms, and that's the way it was. They waged a total war against us. Everything was forbidden. Now this is later on when they were moved to a different village, but they were still sort of in the area of being watched under military law. Everything was forbidden: onions, oil, chicken. They did not permit anything, and we had to smuggle things in from the West Bank. But when they caught someone smuggling, they would kill him. Even sugar was forbidden. I swear, when I gave birth to my son, my father went to ask for permission from the officer to bring oil to anoint the child. When people saw the tanks coming closer to the area, they would throw the oil away so that they wouldn't see it. They would even hide the dates in the chicken coops because it was forbidden. I wish they would return our lands and houses. And so it goes on. I won't talk more now because I think I've spoken enough, and I know Stuart's going to say a few words about South Africa. I did want to say that truth commissions are a fairly common occurrence around the world, and there have been quite a few over the years. The first one was in South Africa. The first ones were in South America, in Bolivia and Argentina. The most famous, of course, was in South Africa in 1995. And since then, there's been about 20 truth commissions around the world. At the basis of them is that only by acknowledging what has happened and taking responsibility and trying to find ways to make recompense can any sort of peace come. And this is certainly at the basis of what Zocrot are doing in Israel. I read an article just the other day by Daniel Barenboim, I think, who spoke about how Jews in Germany had made reparations to Jews all around the world, and it was time now for Jews and for Israel to make reparations to Palestinians. And I thought it was the most remarkable article. In fact, I was going to bring it tonight, but I forgot. But you can find it because it was only about a week old. So I hope that's just given you an idea of the way the narrative around Israel has been created and maintained in the creation of the state. We all grew up in a time where the great, horror of the Holocaust permeated Western culture and Western media. And I think along the way, the subsequent events in Palestine have been, clouded and shrouded in these sorts of narratives, which have really denied the brutality and the horror which continues to this day. So there you go. Thank you.
Look, we've already been privileged, I think, to hear the analysis from Paddy and Cathy, but because the word South Africa is listed in the programme, I'm going to take about 2 minutes only to make somewhat similar points about the development of South Africa as a colonial adventure, which became largely a genocide from about the middle of the 19th century. That's the first point to make, is that the ratio of settlers, of indigenous people to settlers in the middle of the 19th century was about 100 to 1. So that the vast majority of the traditional owners of the land were in a huge majority. The second thing to say is that across Europe there was a well advocated search for land, or grab for land in Africa, as a means of development, as a means of obtaining resources, essentially to develop trade. In the case of the Dutch and the British, to develop trade for their respective East India companies. In the grab for land to build farms and roads, those European nations needed labour, and most of the labour fled. So that you have the development, ironically, about 50 years after the British abolished the slave trade, the reintroduction of slavery to develop South Africa. And incredible punishments were imposed upon the forced labour whoever tried to escape. So much so that to develop a more sophisticated means of control, passes were introduced. the sort of forerunner of the past laws that if any of you know even a smattering of things about the conduct of apartheid South Africa, you would know that the past laws and the sort of gerrymander that went across ethnic and religious lines was a part of the colonial development. By that I mean that the demarcation lines between traditional tribal lands were completely erased by the developers. It's a bit like the famous Sykes-Picot couple of hours in British Whitehall when they decided how they would draw Iraq in a weekend when they were otherwise bored. That may sound like an anecdote, but it's had appalling consequences historically. Perhaps the main thing to remember about the development of South Africa is that it's an echo of what Paddy and Cathy have already said, is that the indigenous people were they were not consulted, they were ignored, or when they didn't comply, they were punished or slaughtered. So that, and until the 27 years long imprisonment of Nelson Mandela and the apparent liberation of South Africa in terms of the expulsion, the disappearance of a white-dominated government and being replaced by the ANC, we get only the disparagement of the indigenous people. They were known, in fact I was taught it in my British school history books, they were known as Hottentots, all of them. No distinction between one tribe and another. And look, if a person in the chair speaks too much, that's a form of violence, at which point I will stop. And announce that there will be about a 10-minute interval, a collection to keep this important public forum going. Jugs, tins, baskets will go around, and you're merely asked to give as much as you can, and even if you don't, you won't be receiving any letters from Centrelink. Please, please get yourselves a drink. We'll start again with questions in 10 minutes' time.